So now we're going to move into the next section of the presentation on wetland restoration. We're going to start this section by talking about wetland loss in Pennsylvania. Historically, Pennsylvania had over 1 million acres of wetlands, but over the course of several hundred years, we lost over half of them, leaving us with less than 500,000 acres of wetlands today. So what happened to the wetlands? Well, some were outright drained or filled, some were excavated or converted into other wetland habitats. Small wetlands like vernal pools and wet meadows were probably lost at higher rates than other types of wetlands just because they're easily overlooked and relatively simple to drain or fill. Today, vernal pools and vernal pool wildlife are protected under a number of state and federal laws. Vernal pools are always under the jurisdiction of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection and sometimes also under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. A permit from DEP is necessary to directly impact any vernal pool or other wetland by fill or excavation, regardless of the size of that wetland. Rare species of plants and reptiles and amphibians that need vernal pool habitats are protected by the Fish and Boat Commission and the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Wetlands are still lost today to development of different types, but Pennsylvania has a no net wetland loss policy, which means that wetlands destroyed today must be offset with construction of a new wetland of equivalent size. Eventually, we hope that Pennsylvania can move from a no net wetland loss to a net wetland gain strategy to try to regain acreage that was lost in the past. Part of the story beyond outright wetland loss is wetland degradation, where erosion and sedimentation, invasive species, other activities like off-road vehicle traffic and road runoff disturb and degrade vernal pools. Gifford-Pinchot State Park had an interesting example of the unintended consequences of land use change. Back in the 50s and 60s, the land use around this particular vernal pool changed from low-density grazed pasture to protected public parkland. And this area was also designated as no hunting area due to its proximity to nearby houses. With the increased deer population and concentration in this area of the park, there was increased deer traffic and deer browse, and there was just a marked increase in disturbance to the soils in and around the pool basin and the adjacent uplands. So we had a loss of understory native plant diversity due to that deer browse and traffic and increasing dominance by invasive species. And there was an additional problem of road runoff flowing down through a small meadow, eroding the soils and carrying those sediments and depositing it into the pool basin. So this pool on the left was in 2004. You can see it's still relatively open and has some healthy vegetation in and around it. But by 2014, it was mostly just a little mud wallow for the deer with a lot of invasives around it. So flash forward, this is one of the sites we restored by removing some of the accumulated sediments, enlarging the pool basin, letting more light in to reinvigorate those understory plants, help stabilize the soils in around the pool basin, and to protect the pool basin a little bit from deer traffic. We also repaired the road runoff erosion problem to help reduce the amount of sediments that were entering the pool. And while loss or degradation of one wetland might not seem so significant in a landscape dotted with wetlands like the lower slopes of South Mountain, but it is worth a closer look. In this aerial photo, we can see some potential vernal pool wetlands that we've mapped using aerial photos and 2-meter LiDAR contours. Potential pools are shown as the lighter blue dots, and these have not been visited on the ground. Confirmed vernal pools have been ground truthed and are mapped as a darker blue. As we zoom in on potential pool clusters in the region, it's pretty apparent that many of these wetlands have been degraded. We're going to look at some examples, not to point fingers at any particular landowner, but to show how collectively over time we have gotten to where we are today with a big need for wetland restoration. So first up is a quarry that is impacting a series of vernal pools inside that blue rectangle along the north edge. Here is a series of vernal pools in a farm field. They haven't been completely ditched and drained, but there's no natural vegetation buffering them, and several have been converted into permanent ponds. And here, several vernal pools were converted into ponds, complete with swimming docks. They were probably treated with chemicals to prevent algal growth and to control pest insects, and fish are often added also to control pest insects, but these insects are actually the base of the food web, and the fish will suppress or eliminate populations of vernal pool amphibians and invertebrates. So I just want to talk a little more about that process of conversion of ephemeral wetlands into permanent ponds, because I think these are low-hanging fruit for wetland restoration. It's not that permanent lakes and ponds are inherently bad. They do provide habitat for wildlife like fish and migratory birds like duck and geese. The problem is just that too many ephemeral wetlands have been lost or converted into ponds. So most wildlife that use permanent ponds will also happily use a vernal pool, but vernal pool specialist wildlife cannot use permanent ponds equally well. Drained and drowned wetlands. So this, maybe some of you have had an aha moment about invasive plants when you realized how prevalent they can be and that green isn't always good. I had a similar aha moment when we were working on our first wetland restoration project with Tom Biebighauser. He's a wetland restoration expert that's helped us with several of our projects, and he showed us how to recognize drained and drowned wetlands. You know, Pennsylvania only has about 50 natural lakes, and except for natural vernal pools, most of our ponds are man-made as well. So now whenever I see a pond or a spring house or a drainage ditch, I try to imagine what kind of wetland was there before. So I don't think it's reasonable or necessary to turn every permanent pond back into its original wetland form. But if you are interested in retiring a permanent pond, and creating a more natural wetland type for our area, then there are alternatives. A pond can be converted back into a vernal pool wetland by reducing the depth and giving the basin very gently sloping sides. You could go even more shallow and create a wet meadow. And these are some examples. The bottom right is a permanent fishing pond that could be converted into the types of wetlands above it and to the left. But bear in mind that authorization is likely needed or required for conversion of a pond back to a vernal pool or wet meadow habitat. So you need to consult with DEP and the Army Corps of Engineers for advice. So even though we are talking about vernal pool restoration here, bear in mind that larger open canopy vernal pools typically turn into wet meadows as they dry down. And in southeastern Pennsylvania, you can visit some really nice wet meadow habitats on some of the local conservancy properties like Brandywine Conservancy, Natural Lands, Wissahickson Trails, and the Nature Conservancy. There's many really nice examples of wet meadows on those properties where these pictures were taken. And you can design your restoration to include a wet meadow that would create additional habitat for pollinators like these beautiful wetland butterflies. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what kind of site is a good site for vernal pool restoration. Well, the good sites are places where you can restore natural hydrology to a wetland that was drained or converted, where you can improve conditions in a degraded wetland. You might look to create pools in places that want to be wet, low places that catch surface runoff, places with high water tables, retired forest roads if they are permanently closed and not at risk for ATV traffic, and seasonally wet sites that attract vernal pool amphibian breeding, but don't hold water long enough, like until late June or July, early July, for the young to leave before the pool dries. For new wetland creation sites, you want to look for locations close to wetlands that were lost, with the new wetland designed to mirror the type of wetland that was lost. Look for wetland creation sites near existing vernal pools in order to make more habitat available for local populations of vernal pool amphibians. And this also ensures that you'll have a source population to colonize your new wetland. Vernal pools created within a half mile of an existing vernal pool is going to have a better chance of getting colonized by those indicator species characteristic of vernal pools. But you just have to be careful. Careful site selection and plan design will help prevent negative outcomes. And post-restoration monitoring will provide, awareness and opportunities to address problems if they do arise. So you just need to be careful that your artificial pool does offer good habitat. If they dry too quickly, they're going to become a sink where amphibian larvae can't escape it before it dries. If they hold water too long, then they end up attracting predators like you find in permanent ponds. You also need to be careful not to impact any wetland habitat, another type of ephemeral wetland that's actually healthy and functioning as it should be. Like these pictures are of different types of spring and seep wetland habitats. These habitats have their own unique wildlife and specialist species. But you don't need to worry too much. These kinds of healthy wetlands will get screened out in your pre-survey and permitting process. They would not be considered good candidates for restoration. So I'm just going to hand it off here in a second to Jack to talk about ways you can identify potential restoration projects. And I'm just going to start by mentioning that here, this is back in our South Mountain landscape. We had an opportunity to do a wetland restoration where there was a cluster of vernal pools inside that white inset on the left-hand side of that inset. These pools, this cluster of 8 pools, all but one were just drying very quickly or not holding water at all. And therefore, amphibians were either trying to breed there unsuccessfully or just didn't use them at all. So this was one of our restoration sites. Because we had healthy vernal pools nearby on the other side of the road here, we knew that we would have source, but also, on both directions, really on all sides of this restoration site, we had the potential to have more amphibians find these sites, and we thought we were pretty confident we could restore hydrology to them. And so now I'm going to hand it off to Jack.
Thanks, Betsy. Hello, everyone. So Betsy, that was really good information on looking at factors that influence ideal or practical locations for doing wetland restoration. And this image actually illustrates an interesting point, and that is sometimes other land management projects or infrastructure problems can open doors for wetland restoration. So drawing your attention to the zoomed in area, you notice in the upper right-hand corner, there's a pine plantation in that aerial photo. And these plantation areas were cultivated and planted in neat rows many years ago. And as the conifers age out, they succumb to disease, wind damage, insect damage, and other issues. And it becomes a problem since all those trees in that stand are all the same age. And at least in parks, there are trails that weave through that plantation. So it not only becomes a resource issue, but also becomes a public safety issue as well for us. So as our foresters consider timber salvage and replanting that area to achieve a more diverse vegetative and forest community, there's a really good opportunity for us as wetland folks to add yet another layer of natural community diversity by restoring topography and wetland pools back into that landscape. So while this particular example is a pine plantation, later in the webinar, we'll actually see an example of how wetland restoration was used to solve an interesting structural liability within a popular state park in Western Pennsylvania. So with that, Betsy, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. So the next section of our webinar is going to walk us through the steps of wetland restoration planning. You want to get off on the right foot early on by talking to the landowner or the land manager before you start your research and find out if you need a research permit. You want to document the current and future goals and concerns for the property. And a good way to do this is maybe with a list of questions that you can fill out, have the landowner or land manager fill out about how the land is currently being used and what the future goals are for it. You want to gather environmental and biological data about the site. This is another place you can interview the property owner or manager regarding what they know about the history of the site. Use Go back as far as you can with historical photos to get an idea of hydrology and landscape changes over a longer historical period. You use aerial imagery to look for signs of past wetland disturbances like wetland drainage, rerouted streams, and you can use GIS data to just provide all sorts of additional information about your soils, geology, waterways, etc. You also want to gather current environmental and biological data, and you're going to continue to engage with your site manager and restoration experts as you go through this process. And it can take multiple site visits to really get a handle on what are your current conditions. You want to create lists of the plant and animal species present on the site, especially species of conservation concern that are known for the site, or potential species of concern based on distribution in the region that you might encounter at your sites. You want to contact resources like local naturalists, parks, the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program, online resources like iNaturalist, and the Pennsylvania Conservation Opportunity Area Tool are all ways to learn more about what is known about your site. And local naturalists and citizen scientists can really make big contributions to these efforts, both pre and post restoration surveys, invasive species surveys, and control activities. So keep them in mind for this process. And you also want to take time to think about establishing your clean gear and equipment protocols for all your surveys pre, during, and post, and also for your equipment. When it comes to construction, you want to make sure that your skid steers and excavators and everything else that come to the site are power washed and free of soils and debris that might carry invasive plant seeds. And we have some some resources at the end of the presentation about how to make sure that you can decontaminate any gear that you're using when you're visiting pools, whether it's your boots or your nets, so that you don't inadvertently spread harmful pathogens that are can harm local amphibian populations. And you also want to enlist the help of wetland experts who can help you with wetland identification, delineation, and assessment. They can read the land looking for signs of, altered drainage, water flow, erosion problems. They can test the soils of the existing wetlands and help you develop that wetland restoration plan based on site-specific goals and environmental conditions. They can assist with environmental review and permitting and your budget development, the whole 9 yards. They can help with overseeing construction and with instructing heavy equipment operators. And they can help modify plans on the fly based on new or unexpected conditions during construction that you might discover. And I'm going to let Jack talk a little bit about how we develop project goals.
Thanks, Betsy. So we'd be remiss in this presentation by not mentioning, while we were developing the webinar and we looked back over our past projects and case studies, it really stood out how important establishing clear project goals was to the success of those projects. I know it probably goes without saying that having clear goals guides the planning, design, and even the permitting process. But having a good handle on goals also serves two particularly important roles. The first of which is clear goals can help identify additional project partners that might not be apparent from the outset. We'll touch on that a little bit more here in a second. And the second important role is clear goals also open up doors to alternative sources of funding. So while we don't have time today to discuss each of these bullet points on the screen in detail, our goal with this list that you see is to simply illustrate the variety of reasons for conducting wetland restoration, and that stacking these multiple goals can sometimes multiply funding and partnership opportunities as well. So for instance, for our state park projects that are mostly driven by the benefit of increased habitat, water quality, and diversity, but those projects can also significantly benefit park visitors by deepening their outdoor experience. And the project can also offer increased opportunities for environmental education at the same time. And this visitor interface and education components can make the project attractive to sources of funding way beyond our traditional avenues that we think of. In fact, Betsy was successful in securing a giant grocery company grant, which will partially fund long-term citizen monitoring of wetland pools at Kings Gap and Gifford Pinchot State Parks. So again, clearly identifying your project goals and thinking about them can help pull in some alternative sources of funding that, again, might not be readily apparent at the outset. Back to you, Betsy.
So just going to touch on a few other considerations. Invasive species is an important consideration. You know, sometimes a site might check some boxes as having potential for restoration. But, you know, if it's in a really heavily invaded place with really bad, you know, invasive species, then you want to think about whether you really have the resources to do the restoration and the long-term work to keep those invasives at bay. So in some cases, it just might not be worth disturbing the soils and just, you know, aggravating a problem that's already bad. But, you know, there's really no place you can work in Pennsylvania where you won't have invasive species to deal with. So just make sure you look at those up front, have a plan on trying to remove or reduce them prior to your restoration being implemented, and then have a plan in place to monitor and control them post-construction. And, you know, just a tool that we used in our last restoration project that took a little bit of planning was to bring in a drone operator to take some footage of our site, both pre-restoration, during the restoration project, and then post. And this is just really a neat way to you know, offer unique perspectives of your restoration site and even bring some, you know, monitoring data for your site. And once you've done all of these steps, all these steps of this process of planning, then you should be able to consolidate your findings into a summary document. And then you can take this document that summarizes what you're trying to achieve, your high-level restoration goals and management recommendations, and go looking for stakeholders, funders, and additional project partners. And those partners will vary by project. You know, as Jack suggested, it really depends on what your goals are. And so your partners will vary as well. At Kings Gap, we had a series of partners who came together for that project. And one of the ones that I wanted to just highlight was the PA Cleanways volunteers. That one of the vernal pools in that restoration site had an illegal trash dump in it. So this volunteer group does a lot of this sort of cleanup work, and they came in and hauled away the trash. And now I'm going to hand it back to Jack to talk about permitting.
So I don't have any jaw-dropping pictures or videos that beautifully illustrate the permitting process, but bear with me. And we could easily spend an entire separate webinar talking about the nuances of permitting. But what our main goal here is to give you a quick overview and then relay some things that we found helpful in navigating the permit process on our projects. So as Betsy mentioned before, most wetland restoration projects will require some level of permitting authorization. At the federal level, that involves the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they regulate the placement of fill within streams and wetlands, or areas that they term waters of the United States. Looking at the state level, Pennsylvania DEP regulates our state stream and wetland resources and what they term waters of the Commonwealth. And also local conservation districts can play a role, mainly with the review of related erosion and sedimentation control plans that are implemented during construction. But also we found that district staff, including their district watershed managers, can really be effective liaisons when interacting with the Army Corps and DEP. If we move to the next slide. So navigating the permit process, it's really all about effective communication and good timing. And engaging the regulatory reviewers at the right time during a project is really key and really helps that planning process. So engaging too early risks not having answers to some of the regulators' questions that they might ask you. And this can limit their ability to offer appropriate guidance as to the type of permit authorization that's required. On the other hand, engaging with regulators too late in the project risks costly redesign or even unanticipated delays if the design doesn't meet permitting requirements. And this can be particularly stressful when trying to adhere to grant funding deadlines or a certain grant window where the money has to be spent or deliverables produced by. So what's the right time to engage with agencies? What's worked for us, at least in Pennsylvania, is this. So first, we gather site information and background. Things like, what was the land use history? What resources are on site? Are there potential rare species in proximity that may spur the need for additional studies or even seasonal construction windows that limit the time of year that construction equipment can be in that area? We also find answers to things like, how was the resource degraded? And you can think of this as a process like painting a picture and really documenting your case of why restoration is needed. Once that's in hand, then it's helpful to examine what options exist to restore the area. So what methods will be employed for restoration? What's the anticipated project footprint? And considering and dismissing certain methods of how you're going to do the restoration is all part of the important documentation of alternatives. And showing that you've looked at alternatives, looked at the feasibility of different restoration options, and chose the best one is really helping regulators do their job. And you're documenting why an existing wetland must be impacted and able to lift the resource. So with background information in hand, and at least an initial idea of how the site will be restored, that's really the ideal time to schedule a pre-application meeting with the regulatory agencies. Next slide, please. So why do we recommend a pre-application meeting? Really, again, it's all about establishing communication and building rapport. The more familiar permit review staff are with you and your restoration work, the more trust is built, and that grows over time, and you start to form a relationship and really paves the pathway for the future. So most of the time from a pre-application meeting, you'll come away knowing exactly what types of authorizations are required, or if the project is unregulated on those rare occasions where a permit's not required. The regulators will also inform what specific information is needed for them to review and issue these authorizations. And just a fun fact, we found that different regulators may ask for slightly different details depending what area of the state you're in. And this is just a matter of different geographic regions of the state have different important resources. And it's also a factor of that permit reviewer's knowledge, experience, and comfort level in reviewing restoration projects. So that, coupled with the fact that there's mandatory documentation that they need to put on file and to have a record of why they approved a particular permit. But in any case, you'll come away from the pre-application meeting knowing what information is needed. And by talking through the permit process, it really helps bring the overall project schedule into clearer focus. And finally, you'll be aware of any post-construction monitoring that may be required as a condition of the permit. And that way you can factor in this monitoring when you're looking at the project budget and timeline. Next slide, please. So speaking of timing, here's some things that we've learned over the years when it comes to project planning and scheduling. And the first is allow more time than you think for scheduling meetings and field views. Everybody's busy nowadays, and sometimes it can take a couple of months to wrangle all the key players together to find a particular date that everyone's available. So it's helpful to be aware of going in. Second, for our projects, we assume design and permitting is going to take 1 full year. And of course, there are exceptions to this. Sometimes design can go quickly. Sometimes an area may end up not being regulated or may be eligible for a waiver instead of a full-blown permit. But at least initially, by assuming it's going to take a year, this rule of thumb really helps to manage expectations early on with project scheduling. Next, we found that when creating a project schedule, it's really helpful to work backwards from your ideal construction window. And you can engage the contractor early on that can help with what that best construction timing is. But that's a good place to start. And then if you find that either the studies needed to gather information or the permit review is going to make that ideal construction time unrealistic, then you can reset the whole project schedule and account for that. And along those lines, as design is going back and forth, whether you're doing it yourself or whether you're enlisting a consultant, or if you submit a permit and there's comments back from the agencies, just keep in mind that often batting that information back and forth can take sometimes 2 to 3 weeks at a time. Again, with everybody's busy schedules, field work, other obligations, sometimes it gets or takes a while to take a look at those plans. So we usually factor in a 2 to 3 week time frame just for those plans and information to go back and forth. And finally, it's important to identify any landowner agreements that may be required for the project, as these landowner documents can take significant planning and it can also take significant time to vet through the legal process. So now that we've talked about all this ideal planning and timing, Joanne's going to share a case study where all of that went out the window pretty quickly.
Yeah, this is a story about a restoration that was obvious, urgent, and unplanned. And so this is about what you do when life hands you a vernal pool crisis. Next, Betsy. So sometimes selecting your site's the easy part, especially when there's a crisis that you have to react to. And this was the case for a restoration that took place in Bell Acres Borough in Allegheny County. It started in 2007 when some borough workers brought buckets of Jefferson salamanders and wood frogs to April Klaus, who is the naturalist at Fern Hollow Nature Center at the time. And they told her that they found them when they were doing a routine visit to a sewage treatment plant, and the animals were falling into the sewage pits and dying. And you can see the sewage treatment plant on this image just above that outline there of the vernal pool. So on further investigation, they determined that the site originally had a large vernal pool on it that was being used as breeding habitat. So the vernal pool ended up being filled in when they did some upgrades to the sewage treatment facility. Unfortunately, the amphibians didn't know that. So in the spring, after the upgrades, they migrated from their burrows looking for a wetland that was no longer there, milled around, and ended up falling into the sewage tanks. So we have an obvious problem here. We have Jefferson salamanders falling into sewage tanks, and that's a species of greatest conservation need. And now they don't have a habitat. So this is a restoration that has to happen pretty quickly. Something needs to be done to save that population. Next. So in the early spring of 2008, April Klaus and some volunteers from Little Sewickley Creek Watershed Association and students from Quaker Valley High School established what they called a safe pond. They did that by burying some plastic cattle tanks that are about 5 feet in diameter and 3 feet deep. They buried them in the ground so that the top of the tank was level with the surface. And then after adding water, they provided leaves, twigs, things to encourage microfauna growth for food for the young amphibians. And then sort of touched up the habitat immediately around the pools with rocks, leaves, twigs, logs, so that the animals had some cover and to make it easier to enter and exit the pools. In the lower image there, you can see in the background behind that person a fence It's just a big piece of metal that they stretched along the edge of the sewage treatment plant so that it acted as a barrier to deter the amphibians from getting in there. So the vernal pool animals successfully used these tanks. But of course, there were issues with some overcrowding and lack of resources. So it wasn't, ideal. It was a Band-Aid, basically, temporary, but not a permanent solution. So we had to move on to look for something a little better. Next. And in 2014, April from Fern Hollow requested assistance from WPC Heritage staff in developing a plan to implement a vernal pool restoration. So we were able to act as a partner and provide some support. She led the project, but we helped them get started by connecting them to Tom Biebighauser, our wetland restoration specialist, the person we've worked with before, and he ended up leading the design and construction of the project for them, which was done in 2015. We were able to plug in a little bit more by providing some site surveys and support with the actual restoration, as well as some follow-up activities like developing a native plant list, helping them relocate some wetland plants to the site, and helping out with some public outreach events. In addition, WPC was able to amend a conservation easement to help protect the property in perpetuity. Next. So, good news, this work resulted in a successfully restored natural habitat for these salamanders and frogs. And the very next breeding season after the restoration, April provided an update for us. She was seeing high numbers of wood frogs and Jefferson salamanders, both eggs and larvae. She saw more viable eggs than when they had the cattle tanks. Water quality was improving. She had good pH, good DO levels, abundant food in the way of daphnia and other plankton. And they were able to naturalize the habitat more so that there were no fences blocking movement of the animals when they were migrating to and from the pond. Next. So this is just a really great story that shows how partnerships can pool resources to react to a pretty urgent need. Fern Hollow and Little Sewickley Creek Watershed raised the funds and led the project to implement the plan. WPC was able to provide technical support through a DCNR Community Partnerships Program. Allegheny County Conservation District was the grantor, so they were able to provide the funding. And then the borough of Bell Acres contributed the heavy equipment and operators, so they were able to reduce some costs that way. And the total project cost was only $10,000, which really worked out and provided just a nice little project area that is still being used for education and outreach activities.